Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcella Paris, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I'd like to welcome you all to the Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This year marks the 23rd season of the Great Falls Forum. Thank you to those of you joining us here on Zoom and Facebook Live. A recording of today's program will be available on the library's YouTube page starting tomorrow. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. And please mark your calendar for the final Great Falls Forum of this season. That'll happen on Thursday, May 20th, featuring Cynthia McFadden, the Senior Legal and Investigative Correspondent at NBC News, on the topic From Maine to Madagascar and Lots of Places in Between. More information on that will also be available at the library website at lplonline.org. A little housekeeping for today's virtual program. Those on Zoom will see a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Use this to enter any questions that you might have for our speakers today. And for those joining us on Facebook Live, go ahead and type your questions in the comment box there, and we will make sure that it gets to our speakers. And today I have the pleasure to introduce our two speakers, Congressman Jared Golden and Professor Mark Brewer. Jared Golden represents the 2nd District of Maine in the United States Congress, where he serves on the Small Business Committee and the Armed Services Committee. He grew up in Leeds, a small town here in Androscoggin County. And after enlisting as an infantryman in the Marines, he deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan before returning home to Maine. Congressman Golden currently lives in Lewiston with his wife, Isabel. Mark Brewer is a professor of political science at the University of Maine. His research interests focus generally on political behavior, with special research areas including partisanship and electoral behavior at the mass and elite levels, the linkages between public opinion and public policy, and the interactions that exist between religion and politics in the United States. Without further ado, welcome to the Great Falls Forum, and thank you both for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Marcella, for having me, and Congressman, thank you for agreeing to sit down for this conversation. I think it's always important for Americans to be able to hear from and interact with their elected officials. So, and it's great that you're giving us the opportunity to do that. So, thank you very much for that. I guess the question I'd like to start off with is, kind of get your impressions about your district, which in many ways is very unique in the United States. We live in a time of increasing partisan polarization and nationalization of politics, but at the same time, the Maine 2nd District has remained a little bit of an outlier here. It's one of the few districts in the country that voted for President Trump and also for a Democrat in 2020. And I'm just interested in what you think makes the district and its people unique. What is it that makes it kind of somewhat of an outlier from the rest of the United States?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks so much again for doing this. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to having a good, fun, and I hope interesting conversation for people that have chosen to spend an hour with us this afternoon. So it is such an interesting district, and I'll tell you, it really surprises a lot of my colleagues in Washington. I'm less surprised. I grew up here, but often people say, what is going on up there? When I'm talking to folks from away who are down in Washington, and they think we're defying the odds and bucking national trends. And it actually, the numbers speak for themselves. We actually are. So in this last one, you mentioned that the district voted for President Trump by around 7 points, and I won by around 6. So I don't know how those percentages quite play out. Maybe you have looked into this yourself, but in reality, I got 30,000 more votes than President Biden did, which is a lot. It's more than any other Democrat in the nation in regards to outperforming the top of the Democratic ticket. I also managed to get about 1,000 more votes than former President Trump did. So even though his margin of victory was bigger by percentage, I got more votes than he did. It's really interesting. But in addition, there was so many different combination of voters that had to have been, right? I mean, Biden, Golden, Gideon, Biden, Golden, Collins voters, Trump, Golden, Collins voters. And when you even go down ballot to the state level races, a lot of split ticket voting behavior is going on at that level too. So it is unique at this time. I wish that wasn't the case. I have some suspicions. I don't have all the answers. You do this, professionally, so I'm sure you have some feedback, and I hope you'll weigh in. But I'll throw out three just quick ideas. One, we are very much a rural town, rural community. For starters, our population as a state, is not very large relative to other states. And then it drills down even smaller. One of the most striking things about Maine's 2nd Congressional District is just how small our towns are and how many we have. We are very, very rural. And that sets up a situation, in my opinion, where if you don't know everyone in your town, there's a good chance you know almost every face. And that's true even in Lewiston, which is our largest city, if you want to call it that. I call it a big town, about 36,000 people. When I tell people that's the biggest town in my congressional district, when I tell folks in Washington that, they can't believe it. So that's one. Two, I sense in my conversations with my constituents what I like to describe as a very healthy skepticism of politics, of institutions, and of government. And there's obviously a line at which that can become cynicism. But I like to describe it as a healthy skepticism. And I think that is very important. And it is connected to what people often say is this independent spirit that exists here in Maine. I don't know what the history of that is, or where it is, rooted, what it is rooted in, but I think it's real. And I think it's a key point I want to make is that when I say independent spirit, that is not to be mistaken for party affiliation or lack thereof. It's not to say that we have a lot of people who aren't in the Democratic or Republican Party, but even, more to say that even those who are still very independent in their, I think, way of thinking about things and of living. And it comes together as a whole where we don't really like being, I think, told by other people what to do, what to think, what is right or wrong. And I really suspect that is key to the political behavior of the district. Third, what I describe as town hall politics, which is a New England tradition. I think we've held on to it here. And I don't mean just my kind of approach to doing the job and having town halls, but town meetings are still a big deal in Maine's 2nd District. We do them every year. I'm asked to send a letter. People still go to these things and they want to have conversations about property taxes and school budgets and all kinds of other things. And our state legislature is unique in this way: 151 state reps, where you are representing like 8,000 people. It's literally possible at that level to go to every single door and talk to your constituents when you're asking for their vote. And at that high a level of state politics, I think it creates an expectation among voters that they're going to hear from their representatives, and they apply that same standard to their federal delegation, myself and Senators Collins and King and Congresswoman Pingree. That is not the case in other states. I say that with authority. In some states, people just don't expect to even get the time to meet with or even meet once their member of Congress. But I think that's what my constituents expect and demand of me.
Following up quickly on that, I would definitely tend to agree with you on that. I mean, I remember when I first moved to Maine in 2001. In some ways, there were a lot of similarities. I'm originally from rural upstate New York, so in a lot of small towns, and so there's some similarities there. But I also was coming out of some activity in New York State politics, which is very different than Maine politics. And that one thing that I noticed very quickly, and I thought it was true then, and I still think it's true now, is that if someone asked me to describe kind of Maine voters in general, and specifically, maybe even more so, Maine 2nd District voters, I would describe them as pragmatic, right? They're they've got this independent streak, along with, as you described it, this kind of healthy skepticism about how politics works, but they also expect it to work, and they care more about how things get done and that they get done rather than who claims the credit for them. And I think that's reflected in the kind of people that they send to public office. And also I am in total agreement on the town hall, the kind of ongoing nature of kind of town hall meeting in especially the second district, along with the small size of state legislative districts, really does kind of give the average Mainer kind of this sense that their participation in politics matters, right? That the expectation is that they're going to be involved, that it's their duty to get involved. And I think that civic culture in Maine is very healthy. And I think you can see that throughout the state, and in particular in the second district with all of these small towns. We're getting ready here I'm in Orono today, and we're getting ready here for our May school board public meeting, where we're going to go and we're going to people are going to ask questions about the budget and what you're going to do, and we'll answer them, and it'll be a conversation. It'll be a socially distanced and masked conversation this year, but it's going to happen nonetheless because it's important. People think it's important, so I would absolutely agree on that. That all being said, Maine, my impression is that politics in Maine are changing to a certain degree, right? That even in the 20 years that I've been here, things have started to become, it seems to me at least, a little bit different. That Maine isn't completely immune to the impact of national politics and the increased polarization that we're seeing across the country. What are your thoughts on this? Do you see the second district changing? Is it becoming either more conservative, more liberal, more Republican, more Democrat? How long can we remain an outlier?
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure. There's no doubt about that, Mark. First of all, every cycle, it seems like a new money spent record is set in regards to our national politics anyway. So in both 2014 and 2016, I can remember the congressional races between Bruce Poliquin and Emily Kane setting spending records. 2018, my first election versus Bruce, once again broke that record. And then in 2020, that Senate race just blew it all out of the water. I mean, it's not even comparable. The level of spending, it was astounding. And I don't expect that in 2022 at that volume, but I think it will still be high. And to put it in perspective for people, the idea that on average, 2018, 2020, my campaign took about $5 million. Just go back to like 2006 or 8 and give it a look at what the two candidates, whoever it was at the time, was it Baldacci and someone else, or Mike Michoud versus, insert, number of candidates he faced. They probably didn't even spend that combined as little as a decade ago. So there's no doubt that it's getting, more money is getting into the bloodstream with every cycle. And a lot of that is being pushed, I would say, from outside of the state, and a lot of it being pushed by super PAC spending, by 501c organization spending. And I mean, that's a rabbit hole. We could go down all of the loopholes that allow those groups to spend to influence elections, when that's really not what they're supposed to be doing. So one, just sheer volume of money, Mark, I think is a problem. We don't even necessarily know how much money is being spent on social media, which brings me to my second point, which is social media and the way that is changing things. It's significant. And it's not just the access to information and how people are now getting their information. It's also where it's coming from. So disinformation is real. I want people to understand that. As someone who's on the Armed Services Committee, there are foreign actors who are playing in this space and pushing out disinformation specifically to divide us as Americans against one another along political lines, lines of race, and many other things. They just want to see democracy fail here in the United States and around the world. But in addition, there's also just bad actors amongst ourselves, people who are just cynical and just will do whatever it takes to win a campaign. And they will use those same tactics that they are seeing foreign actors use, and in many cases use it legally to push out inaccurate, misleading information, either about the opponents or even themselves. I've actually submitted a couple of pieces of legislation this year to try and arm people on social media with at least the types of information that will help them to understand better. Oh, wait a minute, this is a paid advertisement, not just a posting of a legitimate headline. That, I think, is key. Last, the trends on mass media, Mark, you've been following longer than I have, because they started probably around the time I was born and have just gotten progressively worse. But there's no doubt that they are sorting people into buckets, and people are largely consuming their information, here or here. So my old roommate, Max Rose, roommate in Washington, D.C., that is, was from Staten Island. I represent Maine's 2nd Congressional District, two very different districts. We took a much different approach to politics. We would purposely watch Fox News and CNN together to wrap up the day late at night or early in the morning. When I get up in the morning, I will seek out the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and try and see the differences between the two. I don't know how many people do that, or who has the time. But I think that these are just three examples of the pressures that are coming into the district that could change our politics if we're not protective of it. Just to wrap things up, and I think we'll continue this conversation through other means, I still remain confident that we can maintain our way of engaging as a community, the way that we choose to do politics, despite all of that mounting pressure. But it has to be a conscious choice.
Yeah, I think we could see the quintessential example of the outside money and the pressure that it brings in. We could see that in the most recent U.S. Senate race here, right? I mean, just as you said, the sheer amount of money coming in that race was unfathomable. I remember early on in that race, kind of saying to a journalist, I said, well, there's going to easily spending's going to easily top 100 million in this race, and they were like, well, no, and I said, yeah, it's going to. And not only did it do that, but blew way by it, right? I mean, so it was even as someone who was expecting this huge level of spending, it ended up being way more than that. And with that amount of money, it's just the amount of kind of pressure that puts on the style of, representative democracy, the civic culture that we have here just ratchets up. The more the money comes in, the more that pressure ratchets up. So I hope that you're right, that we're going to be able to maintain kind of the what you refer to as our way here.
Let's stay on this just a little bit longer, because this is really key. One of the things that I hear when I am out and about, or when I engage with constituents, I'm not alone in this. So I just did an event last night, by the way, where I was supporting the concept of semi-open primaries here in the state of Maine, along with Senator Chloe Maximum. And she agrees with me about this. We increasingly hear from voters when we're engaging in our communities, going door to door, which I have. You can't win campaigns when you're running to represent 500,000 people by literally going to every home. Like it is possible at the state level, but that's why these types of events or town halls and other things are important to me. But one thing that we hear more and more is that the conversation is shifting because of all of that money. The national message and debate is being brought into our campaigns here in Maine that normally stayed hyper localized. And the more that happens, the more cynical our own people and citizens feel about politics. And then they feel disenfranchised. There's a danger that they don't know what I care about, or my opponent, really, because we're being drowned out by all that national media spending. And they have their own message. They take their national battle and they bring it here into 49 other states. they're not really that smart or intelligent or targeted, in my opinion, in how they spend that money. But it makes people feel cynical and like no one really cares about what they care about. And that's my biggest concern, is that people are going to vote with their feet by just disengaging and saying, you know, I'm not going to participate because I'm not hearing a conversation that matters to me and to my family or to my colleagues at work. And that is, it's bad for a democracy. And I think that's the number one threat that I'm concerned about, that could change our political traditions here.
I think you're absolutely right on that. I mean, it's certainly something that, I've spent a lot of time, over the last, 3 election cycles here in Maine, as we've seen the money ratchet up and up and up, thinking about. And I've long been a person who's been, somewhat of an outlier among scholars of parties and elections. I've been, relatively resistant to campaign finance legislation. I generally tend to agree with the precedent that the court put out in Buckley, that money equals speech to a certain extent. But I'm kind of changing on that front a little bit, and I've always been in favor of disclosure, full disclosure and immediate disclosure, but very resistant to restriction. And I guess I haven't changed completely, but I'm at least open to the possibility now for precisely the reasons that you laid out. So it's definitely a point of concern. I think maybe even for me, a bigger point of concern, and this is going to be something I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on, is first and foremost, and above all else, I'm a parties scholar. And for years, I entered graduate school in the mid 90s, right as kind of the current cycle of party polarization was really starting to grow, right? And as I went through grad school and then got my PhD and was working as an academic, for the vast majority of that time, I've really seen partisan polarization as a positive, right? I thought that it was a very useful development, that it created strong, robust parties with big differences were important in a representative democracy because it gave citizens a clear choice. It proved a very useful kind of queuing device for citizens. They could easily choose a party and a candidate who lined up with their views, right? I'm not so sure I agree on that front anymore. I mean, the last several years have caused me to start to think that we've gotten to the point that party polarization is doing more damage than it has benefits. And I'm wondering if, what your thoughts are as someone who has to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, by the way, is that in this line of work, people often think changing your mind is evidence of some kind of weakness, right? That either an acknowledgement that you were wrong, or flip-flopping is the term that always comes to mind. There was a saying that someone taught me when I was deployed as a Marine in Afghanistan, out in the rural mountains, where it was like I can't remember it, so I'm not going to even try to repeat it, but the gist of it was that someone who's not willing to gather new information and change their mind about something is a fool. And so I actually think it's key to doing this job or any job that you are open to bringing in, evidence of new information or changes in what's going on in the world, and then change your own approach or way of thinking about things. So I suspect you were right in thinking that party polarization could be a positive, motivating factor in American democracy, probably for many, many decades. I don't know where you started your research on that. One could probably start talking about like 19th century like party machines and how important that was or wasn't to our developing civil society. But things have changed a lot. And I actually think they've changed a lot even since I first ran for state office in 2014. I can see it in just 6-7 years time. And as I talk to people like Senator King or Senator Collins, who've been doing this even longer, they've been watching it change steadily for the last 10, 20 years. So I agree with you. And it's becoming, I think, a barrier to getting, important work done in Washington for the country. There comes a point where people, I think, are no longer motivated by that polarization, because they do, at the end of the day, want this country to be successful. They want their communities to be successful, and they want to know that there's a government, a Congress that can deliver results. And people are getting tired of, I think, discussions about gridlock. Oh, but nothing ever changes. But I think we're building to that. I don't know what's going to pop that pressure balloon. Is it going to be the creation of some kind of third party? Is it going to be some big change to how we do our elections? Is it going to be campaign finance reform? I don't know, but it's why I'm so interested in talking about these policies that might bring about change on many different fronts.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a political scientist at Yale by the name of David Mayhew, and I'm pretty sure he's retired at this point, but he wrote this book called Divided We Govern, and it looked at how productive or not productive Congress was during periods of unified or divided government. And he looked at I think it was the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, maybe a little bit in the late 60s. And what he found was that, whether government was unified or divided in terms of policy output, it didn't really make any difference, right? Because the branches and the parties were able to come together, even if government control was divided, and they were able to work out a deal, work out a compromise, and get things done. Now, the nature of the policy might look a little bit different on unified versus divided government, but stuff still got done. If you were to do that research today and update that book over the last 10 to 15 years, the answer would be much different, right? The answer would be that during periods of divided control, it's much less productive, much less is getting done. And I do think that frustrates people, and justifiably so. And it's particularly, I think it's felt particularly poignantly here, to go back to maybe where we started the conversation off, because Maine politics aren't like that. Maine politics are pragmatic, and they get things done. And it's why when you see something like happened in the Maine legislature, a couple of weeks ago, when the Democrats just used parliamentary procedure to shove the budget through, that it's kind of jarring, because you're just not used to seeing that here. So I agree with you. In kind of the area of focus on what could change this, because I don't have an answer to that. I've got some possible ideas, but I don't think any of them are guaranteed to work. And I think you're also right that there will be something will come, to foster change. Because if you look back over, a lot of people think this high level of polarization is the first time happening in the United States. It's not. There have been these periods before. Something's always happened to change them. Oftentimes it has to be some kind of large scale disaster or crisis. I hope that's not what this needs. I mean, you would think that COVID might fit the bill on that, but so far maybe it hasn't. So I guess the question I'd like you to weigh in on next is how can we combat this polarization? Is this due to gerrymandering? Is this due to the way that we conduct our primaries? Is this due to changes in how members of Congress socialize? In DC, it used to be that members of Congress spent huge amounts of time in DC. Their families experienced each other socially across party lines. They built relationships. And it's hard to really despise someone of the other party if you're out bowling with them on Friday night. That doesn't happen anymore. So what can we do on this, if anything?
You just tied it back to Maine in a really nice way, Mark, and I think that's important. That's why we're having this conversation. And so going back to Max Rose, by the way, my old roommate, former congressman, he did not win his reelection in 2020. He was representing Staten Island. He used to listen to me, from his perspective, rant and rave, and obsess over process and how poor and broken the process is in Washington. And early on in our 2 years together, he would say, "No one cares about process back home, Jared. They only care about how what you do impacts them. immediately. And I would tell him, you're wrong. I think what might be true is that we were both right, because by the end he was saying, wow, Jared, I'm really amazed how much your constituents are tuned in and paying attention, and like they're actually following the process and they seem to care about it. And so I won him over as a convert, at least as it relates to Maine's second congressional district, and I think the whole state of Maine. Outcomes matter most, no doubt. Process is wicked important. It is here, and I think it actually is nationally. It's just people are discounting it, and that's part of our problem. When I first got to the legislature, I had all these big plans and ideas and things I wanted to get done, in particular to help veterans in the state of Maine. This is the state legislature, and I had experienced lawmakers say to me, there's a process, Jared, that you have to engage with and follow it. You can't just come in here like a bull in a china shop and demand everything, because we all have communities to represent in core needs and priorities. And I kind of rolled my eyes. But I learned over time that they were actually right, that the process is really key to the health of the legislative body, and therefore the health of the body politic in the state. And nationally, the process is broken and our politics are broken. So anyways, I'm going to disagree with you on the COVID piece. Almost $4 trillion in super bipartisan, super majorities voting for the CARES Act, for two pieces of legislation that quietly preceded the CARES Act that originated in the House with some very important provisions, to include the unemployment piece, the federal plus up, and then the additional money in April for the Paycheck Protection Program, which Senator Collins played a key role in structuring, and then finally in December, almost another $1 trillion that almost the entire Congress, House and Senate, ended up supporting. That's a massive bipartisan response to a crisis, the pandemic. It's part of why I was upset about the process chosen for budget reconciliation for this latest COVID-related relief plan from the Biden administration. There was nothing in the history of the last year that suggested that getting it done in a bipartisan way was impossible. And yet overnight, we were supposed to believe that was the case. I'm not buying it. Anyways, in regards to what we can do about it, there's so many things. We touched on campaign finance reform. That's important. It's not a silver bullet. Ranked choice voting here in Maine, which really ought to just be poorly named, Mark. Nothing against the people who chose that name, but just call it an instant runoff. That's all it is. It's just an instant runoff, right? And a requirement that someone wins with 50 plus 1%, 50% of the vote plus one.
That's what everybody else calls it, except for us.
Yes, it's that simple. But anyways, I'm interested now in semi-open primaries where unenrolled voters in Maine could choose to vote in a Democratic primary or a Republican primary. Why? Well, because they represent a massive plurality, at least, of the voting population, and yet they have no say in the primary election. Perhaps more consequential in CD1 than in CD2. And wherever you see a gerrymandered district, whether it be gerrymandered Democrat, blue, or Republican, red, you have a massive amount of unenrolled voters who have almost zero voice. They have no voice because the primary basically decides who will be the representative. And that is 80% of Congress is essentially locked in through the primary system. I consider myself blessed to be from one of those 20% of districts where there's a real general election debate. And I think it gives me strength that I can draw upon, that I actually have to engage with a diverse constituency of Democrats and Republicans and independents who are everywhere in between. And by the way, I don't think people are Democrats I don't think people are progressive or conservative. I think people are made up of progressive and conservative values. And from issue to issue, they can fall into line with a party policy or priority. And all of that comes together into like one human being. And so I think that's like a key point. But so gerrymandering, I think would be key. Nonpartisan, independent commissions that choose congressional districts based upon an agreed upon set of criteria that is not political would help fix this problem. And then we can look at some electoral reforms, perhaps like opening up primaries. Other states do what are called like jungle primaries, instant runoffs, ranked choice voting, whatever it may be. All of it, I think, for me, is focused on getting people more engaged with our political process. Just civic engagement is, I think, key to the health of our democracy.
It's refreshing to hear someone put so much emphasis and talk so much about process, because really, I've got a friend of mine who we've been friends a long time, and he always says, that the process isn't exciting or sexy, but it's incredibly important. If you get the process right, that your chances of getting kind of the right outcome increase exponentially. And I think that's absolutely true.
So we're gonna do Q&A here in a minute, but let me finish on a story that shows people what I mean by that. When I was in my first term in the state legislature, I had put about a year and a half into, first I passed a law to create a commission to look at the services available to mental health services, in particular to veterans in the state of Maine. And after chairing that commission over the course of several months, first of all, I followed someone's advice that commission, in issuing its report and recommendations to the legislature, would only put out recommendations that had full consensus, even though it was a panel of Democrat and Republican lawmakers and members of the public. I made that decision, and we worked it hard, and we got to consensus on so many things. We put out, a dozen strong recommendations that became 5 or 6 different bills reported out to the legislature. And they all made their way through the committee process, and they got down to the House floor, where I broke from people's advice about process and tried to do something that is never done on the House floor, which is offer a floor amendment to bring them all together and try and pay for it, essentially trying to bypass the Appropriations Committee. People were very upset. In particular, the Republicans were very upset. We had a 2-day debate that for a debate about helping our veterans, about access to mental health, about doing something about veterans' homelessness was way too contentious. You could sense that everyone wanted to get to yes, but the process had been shaken up. I had good intentions. I wanted to not see these bills die unfunded in the appropriations room, which often happens. And that is part of the process. Anyway, long story short, after 2 days of tough debate, someone went on the local news and said that I was wrapping myself in the American flag for wanting to ensure that veterans like myself in the state of Maine were going to have access to the care that they earn through their service. And that's part of the deal. You serve the country, you go and you fight for the country in a place like Afghanistan and Iraq. You ought to know that you're going to be taken care of when you come home. Anyways, and by the way, the person that said that about me on the 6 o'clock news, I'm still friends with today now, right? We worked through it. But John Martin came to me, Representative John Martin came to me late in the evening after 2 days of tough debate and said, Jared, there's a couple of things that need to be tweaked in this proposal. You need an amendment. And by the way, after you've drafted the amendment, give it to a Republican veteran and let him offer that amendment tomorrow morning on the House floor. And that's what we did. And it took all of the tension out of the air. And all of a sudden, the debate shifted like that overnight, from conflict between two parties to collaboration. The job got done, and everyone on the House floor ended up supporting it. Everyone deserved credit at the end of the day for what got done. And it wasn't about me, and it wasn't about either party. And for the good of veterans' healthcare, that's the right thing for the veterans community, right? Is that neither party thinks they have ownership over the issue. So that was one of the most important lessons I learned about why the process does matter, and why doing it the right way pays at the end of the day, in the short run and in the long run.
At this point, I guess we should probably shift gears and go into the Q&A portion of the event. And we do have some questions that have come in. One of them, it's not particularly directly on topic, but it does speak to this issue of process. And we've got a question here from Lou, who says that I really feel we should change our way of voting for president to the popular vote. I feel the electoral college system really favors people in power. I feel my vote doesn't count. And I think wants to know your thoughts on the electoral college in terms of process.
So I'm always hesitant to jump on to something like as big as this without really researching it. That's the first thing I would say. So I haven't taken a position one way or the other. Here's the crux of the debate from the perspective of Maine's 2nd district. Right now, as you know, we split our electoral college votes in Maine, one of only 2 states that do that. And a lot of people feel that as a result, we get more attention as a very small rural congressional district, outsized attention in the presidential campaign, which heightens our stature and may result in by getting that type of focus, maybe a desire to pay more attention and send more resources to address the issues that are raised during that campaign. And so that is one argument against getting rid of the electoral college. A lot of people, however, if you go and do some research about those that think we should shift to the popular vote, would argue that the electoral college really directs power to a handful of very important states, Florida and Ohio. Think about, those two, where we see the most spending, the most attention being paid, and all of this to the detriment of a state like Maine, or a state like, I don't know, Wyoming, or Missouri, wherever. So both sides, I think, have valuable points. I'm not, I'm not 100% sold on the need for it, but I do understand the concerns that are raised. That being said, our new President Biden, built a pretty impressive victory, and both of these presidents got historic popular vote counts. But at the end of the day, I would say that the Biden team also won by a pretty large electoral college victory. It was a very strong win. I don't know if that changes, the person who asked the question's mind about it, because I do understand, some of the frustration that has gone into that. And I think really the first thing that started to build that frustration with the system was the first presidential election I ever voted for in 2000, with Florida and the hanging chads and all in the Supreme Court case and everything that went into that.
Great. Next question, I think you've answered this one partially, but this questioner brings in an element that we touched on, but I think we kind of left maybe a little too soon. And the questioner asks, as someone who recently moved back to Maine from upstate New York, I've actually been very disappointed in how much more partisan and polarized things have gotten here, to the point where I got rid of my social media. And then it says in parentheses, best decision ever. What do you think the best thing we can do? What do you think the best thing we can do is to fight this crazy polarization? And I know we touched on that, but I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the social media element of it, because that to me seems to be a big part of the problem here, but I'm not sure what we do about that.
Well, I share the concern expressed, but I want to make sure and give you a positive note. It's not as partisan as you think it is. The social media echo chamber is awfully loud, but when you look at the data of the number of Twitter handles connected to the state of Maine, and then follow the political traffic on Twitter in the state of Maine, you will see a very, very, very statistically small number of people, but are they loud. Same with Facebook. More people on Facebook, certainly, but using it, I think, for many different reasons. But still, they can dominate the political discussion on Facebook. and this is true on all other social media platforms in my experience. This is not a commentary on national trends. I have not looked at any data or really paid attention to. This is just my own personal experience. For instance, in my primary in 2018, if you just gauged who would win the campaign based upon what was being debated and discussed on social media, in the volume of support or opposition being expressed for specific candidates, and there were 4 or 5 of us, you wouldn't have thought that I was going to win. But when you followed the threads back to the people who are having the discussion, you quickly realize like this is like 2% of the likely voting population here. The real conversations on Main Street, Maine, it's out in the communities, and it's at the workplace, it's at the dinner table or wherever. And that those conversations tend to be far less hyper partisan in my experience. So I actually think we're doing pretty good. But I have a personal test for social media. I don't have personal social media, by the way. I have the Congress page and Twitter. My staff handle that. They don't even give me the keys. They don't want me out there tweeting my opinion about everything, and nor do you want my opinion about everything. But I have a key litmus test that I think everyone should apply is if you wouldn't go across the street and say it to your neighbor, why would you post it on social media? That's just the way that I think about it. But I am often very surprised what people are willing to say about me or about other people on social media. And then, by the way, bump into me because sometimes I know these people and like wave and say, how you doing? So there's a weird disconnect there. It's like getting, being behind the steering wheel with road rage and honking and flipping people off. Like, it's like, folks, we've got to get back to the human connection here. If you wouldn't do it, when sitting in the room with Mark Brewer, speaking to him to his face, then it should be no different. But that doesn't answer your question about what to do about it, Mark, or the concerns being expressed. I mean, you don't want to stifle free speech. We talk a lot about that, right? I feel like a lot of it is going to be about trying to make sure that, for one, I think monopolies in the media space is a problem. People need to have good competition in there, and they should be competing to get people onto their platforms, and people with differing viewpoints would be one thing that we should look at. And then just I'll talk very quickly about my latest amendment that I got into, HR 1, which I voted for and supported in the House. People can pay to advertise something on social media that looks like it's not an advertisement. But when it's initially put up, it has to have this banner that shows, it lets you know, like, someone paid to put this in front of me. It's an advertisement. It's not a opinion piece, or it is not a legitimate source of news, even though it was often they're structured to look that way. But when Mark Brewer decides, I want to share this with my network, the paid for banner drops. And now it is presenting itself like that factual piece of news that it was structured to look like. And Mark is an influencer in his network. People trust Mark. And so now they're consuming it in a different way than he did, because he knew it was paid for. And in fact, when you pay for that advertisement, if you're smart, you could just get a whole team of people to go and repost your advertisement and get it flowing through the system. I have an amendment that would make sure that paid for banner stays with it throughout its entire life. Which is essentially forever. These, things live on the internet forever. So people will at least have more access to analyze and be skeptical, the way I think Mainers are good at, being in a healthy way, the information that's in front of them.
One more question kind of in the same line, and then maybe we'll shift gears because there's a couple other ones I'd like to get to as well. But this question is from James, and it says, polling shows that Democratic and Republican voters agree much more on policy questions than their representatives show in their voting patterns. And then there's something else in there, but it closes with, is there any way to bring Congress together around that degree of agreement that Democrats and Republicans out there in the electorate show?
Yeah, there are ways, but first let's talk about polling, because one thing that's very striking to me right now in the Washington D.C. conversation is everyone is saying, well, the polling shows that this legislation or that legislation has strong bipartisan support. 60%, 70% of the American public supports it. So why won't Republican lawmakers in particular get behind it? But just last November and December, we were all, consuming information, some of us outraged about how poor polling has performed in predicting the outcome of elections in 2020, prior to that in 2016. And by the way, some people have said Jared, was winning by like 20 points, but he only won by 6 points. Like, what happened? Like, did he blow it? Did he almost blow it? Did he make a mistake? No, my internal polling showed a much tighter race than a 20-point spread throughout the entirety, but the public polling was showing a blowout. And so I think that people need to be able to distinguish between polls and like micro data behind those polls, where you can really dig in and get some accurate and helpful information, whereas public polling is often very top level, very macro and broad. And I don't know that you can really rely upon it to know what your constituents actually think about something. And so you can ask someone, would you like a $1,400 check from the government? And probably yes, 70% of people would say yes to that. Or gun control is a good one that comes up. But what you find is when you start getting into the specifics of policy proposals, is support for those things starts to fracture out. And then you have pluralities of support. It's harder to bring them all back together into a single bill to reform on a specific issue. That's one thing. But secondly, I think a lot of the things Mark and I talked about relevant to money and politics and to the broken system may have more to do with the sometimes lack of willingness of collective groups of lawmakers to support things that it seems like the public supports.
Great. We'll shift gears because we've got just a few minutes left. There's a couple of questions along this line, so I'm going to kind of combine them and paraphrase a little bit. But a couple of people in the Q&A are wondering what it was like to be on Capitol Hill on January 6th during the storming of the Capitol. And we're kind of really interested to hear what it was like to experience that.
Yep. Well, first, I would point out I wasn't on the House floor because of COVID and people wanting to reduce the volume of people on the floor at any given time. The folks who were down there were the ones who were likely to be debating specific state electors that were going to be challenged. And so I was in my office and I had told my staff to stay home for the day. Because I did suspect that there might be protests. I didn't expect anything like what happened on January 6th, but I thought the commute could be potentially dangerous because there had been some violence between opposing groups protesting in the Capitol over the previous 6 months. And I didn't want them exposed to any type of risk, so they were working remotely. So I was alone in the office. It was, I think, unique for members who weren't on the floor to be able to watch the news feed of a growing mob, even overrunning outer, picket lines of law enforcement officers and making their way to the Capitol and understanding that this was turning out to be a violent group and not a peaceful protest. People on the House floor were almost completely unaware of what was building up outside. It's definitely, as someone that served in Afghanistan, Iraq, in the infantry, it's unsettling to be hearing flashbangs, dispersed by the dozens, and banging and blasting just outside my congressional office. Pipe bombs were planted just around the block from where my office was, I believe, as a distraction to draw manpower away from the defenses of the Capitol. I recognize that almost immediately as a military tactic, very concerning. So, I was concerned first and foremost for the safety of my colleagues on the House floor as I saw that it looked like the Capitol may be breached. A range of emotions, from anger to a deep sadness for the country as a whole to have that happening and taking place. And it followed by a resolve to stay there and get the job done that night, which was shared by every one of my colleagues in both the House and the Senate, and that's what we did. But look, I went through some of the motions that someone who's been in the Marine Corps Infantry has been in. I secured the perimeter of the office. I was prepared perhaps to have all of our congressional offices overwhelmed in a way similar to the Capitol. Very disturbing. I felt reasonably safe and like I would be able to manage the situation. But I think we were lucky on that day. As bad as it was, I think it could have been much worse. I think we're lucky that more people did not lose their lives, both protesters and law enforcement officers. I think we're lucky that lawmakers of either party were not dragged out into that crowd, and that far worse could have happened. That is not to make light of the day, because it was terrible, and it remains a point of deep concern for the health of our democracy, and has only made me more committed to paying attention to the types of issues and reforms that Mark and I discussed briefly over the last hour.
Great. I don't think I'll ever forget sitting in my couch with my kids, kind of watching that and trying to explain to them what was going on. And I think, for me, your point of sadness, it sums it up. It was just it was a sad day, and I can only imagine what it was like to be there and have to experience that. So
unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. We're so much better than this. The world looks at America and sees a democracy that has been able to solve our differences, because we have them, peacefully through our democratic processes. And that's why, again, my obsession with process. That's what makes us different than so many other places in the world who settle their differences violently and with conflict, not the right type of conflict. And I think that's one of the key points that we all have to stay focused on. The way to beat this back and do something about it is to recommit to that way and that system of government that our democracy is rooted in, and it's what has made us special. We've held together largely without violence, with the exception of moments in time like the Civil War. So it's incredibly important. I fought in Afghanistan in the midst of a presidential election where violence was at the polls, and it was our job to try and protect people so they had the freedom to vote. In Iraq, I did it again. I have seen political assassinations taking place in Iraqi towns, and to see political violence spilling out on the streets of America just a little over a decade later, I never would have imagined when I was 23 years old serving our country in those two places. And it's just unacceptable. We can't accept it, and we have to commit ourselves to doing our own individual parts. Really, I think by engaging in this process, in this democracy, and by the way, having respect for one another, I guess would be my final word. We're all in this together.
I want to thank you both again for your participation today. This was very, very fascinating and illuminating. And to everyone else, a reminder that the full talk will be available on the library's Facebook page immediately after the forum, but also on the YouTube page sometime this afternoon or possibly tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.